Hello, my name's Carl Phillips, and I'm a new author to Carcanet. My book that's coming out this February, my book of poems, is called Then the War, and Selected Poems 2007 to 2020. A new poet to Carcanet, but not a new poet. This is actually going to be my 16th book of poems, and I'm very excited to be making it across the pond over to a British publisher, especially this one. I love the books Carcanet publishes, and I love the voices they publish. So I'm in a kind of unlikely place. I thought about where I should video this, and I realized I was just going to be nervous about it. And so then I remembered that at the beginning of 2020, I decided, just for fun, though it ended up being a whole year of it, to do a live cooking show on Instagram once a week. And I would make things, the theme was making things from scratch based on what you have at hand, given that at the time we were in lockdown, and so there wasn't the luxury to just run off to the store for any ingredient. And it became a sort of, Instagram hit. And I would also sing songs while cooking and preparing and dance. And I guess be myself, but I think it was a surprise to some people. I think people think of me as kind of a serious type. And then they found out the truth. So I thought, why not film this in the kitchen? I actually have some kitchen work to do anyway. I need to cut up this cabbage so I can make some braised cabbage for dinner tonight. Well, to accompany dinner. And that will put me at my ease. Let's see if it works. All right, something about myself. Well, I mentioned the excitement about being published over in the UK. Part of that excitement is that I'm half English. My mother, who was white and was born and raised in Ealing, outside of London. And my father, who is black, was born and raised in Alabama. And I gather they met when he was stationed there in England in the 50s. Anyway, that's my sort of identity background, racial background, I suppose. And it's maybe important in part because it might explain something about my work. I guess my subject began being the body, desire, same-sex desire in particular. But it's sort of evolved also into being philosophical about morality. My poems, I like to say they exist in the intersection between what society tells us about how we should conduct our bodies and how we ourselves as individuals want and choose to conduct our bodies, and how often those two things come into conflict. A very simple example would be being queer. And if society says, well, the norm is for every man to be married to a woman, paired off with a woman. But what happens if you're a man and you're physically, sexually attracted to other men? So by being yourself, you're in contradiction with societal norms, but to obey societal norms would be to erase yourself. That's more or less the space within which I write. And that includes different kinds of marginalization. Mostly my work focuses, I suppose, on the queerness aspect, but race to some extent, because growing up in the 60s and 70s as a biracial kid here in the United States, probably is still challenging, but it was definitely a challenge then. There's always this idea that you're never quite this or that. You're not white enough, you're not black enough, you're too white, you're too black. So there's always this sense of you're just being yourself and somehow not fitting in. And I suppose that's where the poems come from. And no doubt because I studied in college classics, I majored in Greek and Latin, occasionally there's references to things like the Iliad or the Aeneid. I'm interested in Greek tragedy. That's probably where I got the whole idea about people being in conflict with what expectations are. Like in that play by Sophocles, Antigone, where her family duty, what she wants to do, is bury her brother. But because her brother's been declared an enemy of the state, it's forbidden to bury him. So what does she do? All right, so that's something about the work, what it comes from, where it comes from, and about me. I suppose I could do something with this cabbage, huh? I mean, I do need to I wasn't making it up. So cut cabbage. On the show, I would show people sort of very basic things sometimes, like how do you cut a cabbage? It's not an obvious thing, and so I would explain to them about cutting it a certain way so you can cut the core out. There you are, it's gone. How to slice it then, how to braise it. We're gonna braise it in sort of curry and butter. That was how the show worked. Anyway, I was asked to speak about my process of putting the book together. I actually can't put books together in a self-conscious way. I don't sit down and think I'm going to write a book over the next few years. I can only go poem by poem, and I can't know what it is I'm writing about when I'm writing it. I can't sit down and say, I'll write a poem about my dog. Immediately, I can't do it. And kind of made me a bad student, not good on following orders and assignments. Anyway, so I kind of wait for poems to arrive. Usually doing mundane tasks like walking a dog, cutting vegetables, words will come to mind, an idea, a snippet of a phrase, and I'll just record it. I'll put it on my phone or write it in my notebook. And then if I'm lucky, a couple times a month, some evening I'll stare at my sort of collection of scraps and something will start to gel. And often by the time I've finished, I'm not sure exactly what I am writing about. It takes me a couple days to realize, oh, this is what that came from. This is where it's headed. So that's how I go about composing individual poems. And likewise, I can't plan the trajectory of a book. So what happens is I usually at some point just feel like a door has shut, and I'll look at my list of poems that I've written, and I'll realize I've written maybe 40, 50 since the last book. And out of those, I have this whole thing where I, in general, think a book of poems is pretty good at 30 to 35 poems. Not more, a book not more than about 60 pages. That's my preference. That's what I like to read. I can read it in one sitting. And I think the challenge is precision and how to convey what you mean, not through 100 poems, but a third of that. And so I'll then sit down, usually in some night, and very quickly, sometimes after a few glasses of wine, put the poems together in what feels instinctively right. And in the morning, that's not usually the answer, but I've got some kind of sense of, these poems are now in this configuration. I can see how they're speaking to one another, and I start to see what the book might be gesturing towards. And so that's how the composition of the book goes. For this particular book, it was initially just the part of the book. The thing about this book is it's a whole book of poems inside a larger book that also contains selected poems. Most people, when they do a new and selected, tend to have maybe a dozen new poems, and then we go back into the past. And nothing wrong with that, but I've always resisted that kind of book for myself because it feels like a kind of interim book, as if the poet didn't have enough poems for a real book, and so they just had a dozen, and then they figured, well, and then I'll have a retrospective. That's fine, but that's not how I work. And so I had already written a complete book of poems called Then the War, and in fact, it was already taken to be published here in the United States. And then I learned that Carcanet wanted to do some kind of book that would introduce me, like maybe a selection across the years. And it's not that I didn't want to do that, but I had this new book that I was very excited about. And after some back and forth about, how could this all work, somewhere the idea came together of what if we have the whole new book and then it's followed by selected poems. So it might seem like a new and selected, but it's an actual total new book and some selected poems. That's how it came together. And in terms of the selection process for the selected part, I knew that I wanted to include a chapbook that I had done in 2019 that had not been part of another book. And then the idea was I already had a selected poems that came up to 2006, so we started 2007. And then it just became the challenge of how to choose a fairly small number, usually 8 poems from a book, poems that in themselves could stand by itself, but at the same time together would fairly accurately represent the trajectory of the whole book that had been the initial context for those poems. So that was the challenge. But again, I do these things very instinctively. So I did them in an evening. I just made some selections quickly and instinctively. And then the next day, there was a little tinkering, taking some out, adding some others. And that was that. It's not that I don't believe in thinking about things, but I sometimes think you can overthink. And I trust my intuition, I suppose. It's lasted me all this time, and I'm 62, so may as well go with it. I was asked to speak about some books that maybe have blown me away recently that I was very impressed by. I mean, 2 very different kinds of answers. One is going to seem like I'm just being nerdy and boastful. War and Peace by Tolstoy. During the initial year, 2020, of pandemic, Yi-Yun Lee, the novelist, sort of created with this magazine, A Public Space, created a sort of online through Twitter reading group of War and Peace, where we would just read 12 pages a day for, as it turned out, 85 days. That's how long it takes. And it was an interesting lesson in slow reading, in also an alternative way to approach something that's very daunting. I tried to read that book a few times in my life, but there's something about picking up a 1,200-page book that is just intimidating. But the idea that we only have to do 12 to 15 pages a day, and also during pandemic, since we were in lockdown, it became, and because this was a community of people online, where we would all be sending in our comments here and there, tweeting what we thought about the latest each day's reading, it became a community, and a kind of showed how reading can be a real rescuing force, and also it became a study because of the slow reading of it. Became a kind of a sort of proof, I suppose, that that maybe slow and patient is often the way to actually maybe experience something more deeply, more meaningfully. That's at least how I felt about it. And so, War and Peace, that blew me away. On a more contemporary note, a book that came out last year, Filthy Animals by Brandon Taylor. You may know of him because his first book, his novel, Real Life, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, maybe in 2020. And so, anyway, I read both those books. They both blew me away, but Filthy Animals was the more recent book. And Brandon explores some of the issues I'm interested in. Estrangement from society, estrangement from oneself, often within the context of queerness, of blackness, and of the Midwest of the United States. Beautiful sentences and very daring and provocative approaches to the subject of how we make meaning together as bodies and as minds. So those are 2 things that have blown me away. And finally, a favorite poem from this book of mine that's coming out. I can't really pick a favorite poem. You know, they all, I think of especially the book itself, then the war, that part, it's a book that's all of a piece. And so it'd be like saying, what's your favorite body part? Well, you need all of them to actually live. But one that I, this morning anyway, am interested in is a poem called Something to Believe In. And I think it might be somewhat representative because it brings in morality. It also brings in the classical element, in this case, the Iliad, but also ordinary daily life, animals, which often figure into my poems. So I'm going to read this and finish this video. This is called Something to Believe In. My 2 hunting dogs have names, but I rarely use them. As I go, they go. I lead, they follow. The blue-eyed one first, then the one who's coloring her coat, not her eyes. I sometimes call, never again, oh never this way, henceforth. Hope, ambition, these are not their names, though the way they run might suggest otherwise. Like steam off night-soaked wooden fencing, when the sun first hits it, they rise each morning at my command. Late in the Iliad, Priam, the king of Troy, predicts his own murder. Correctly, except it won't be by spear as he imagines, but by sword thrust. He can see his corpse, sees the dogs he's fed and trained so patiently, pulling the corpse apart. After that, he says, when they're full, they'll lie in the doorway, they'll lap my blood. I say, why shouldn't they? Everywhere, the same people who mistake obedience for loyalty think somehow loyalty weighs more than hunger, when it doesn't. At night, when it's time for bed, we sleep together, the 3 of us. Muscled animal, muscled animal, muscled animal. The dogs settle to either side of me, as if each were the slightly folded wing of a beast from fable, part power, part recognition. We breathe in a loose kind of unison. Our breathing ripples the way oblivion does, routinely, across history's face. Thanks.